Welcome to Exploration Dreamland, a quiet read aloud of the writings of explorers of the real world and the worlds of imagination. Drop anchor, relax into your comfortable bunk, and drift off to Dreamland with us as we read a lightly edited version of The Gradual Acceptance of the Copernican Theory of the Universe by Dorothy Stimson, Ph.D., published in 1917. It traces the web of ideas of famous thinkers and mathematicians about the structure of our galaxy through time. The book will be read in order, so if you would like to begin at the beginning, please start with Season 5, Episode 96. This work was written quite some time ago, and therefore does not necessarily reflect current-day outlooks and language choices. The scientific texts may use outdated terminology or be inaccurate in light of more recent discoveries. This podcast was created primarily to help you relax and to entertain you. The texts are chosen for their ability to charm and interest you, rather than for educational purposes. Apologies in advance for any mispronunciation. I am unfamiliar with most of the languages used in this book, but have done my best with online pronunciation guides. If you would like to stay in touch between episodes, you can follow us on Blue Sky, Instagram, or Facebook at Exploration Dreamland. If you have a moment to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, even if you don't listen there, it helps more than you know. You can also hear our episodes on YouTube. If you are listening there, please like our episodes and leave a comment for us. We love hearing from you. Now, take a deep breath in, and as you exhale, relax any tension in your muscles. Close your eyes, snuggle into your sleeping space, and listen to tonight's tale. Chapter 3. The Opposition and Their Arguments. The Protestant leaders had rejected the Copernican doctrine as contrary to the Scriptures. The Roman congregations had now condemned Galileo for upholding this doctrine after they had prohibited it for the same reasons. These objections are perhaps best summarized in that open letter Foscarini wrote to the general of his order, the Carmelites, at Naples in January 1615. The letter that was absolutely prohibited by the Index in March 1616. He gave these arguments and answered them lest, as he said, quote, "Whilst otherwise the opinion is favored with much probability, it be found in reality to be extremely repugnant, as at first sight it seems, not only to physical reasons and common principles received on all hands, which cannot do so much harm, but also, which would be of far worse consequence, to many authorities of sacred Scripture. Upon which account many at first looking into it exploded as the most fond paradox and monstrous capriccio that ever was heard of. Yet many modern authors, he says further on, are induced to follow it, but with much hesitancy and fear, in regard that it seemeth in their opinion so to contradict the Holy Scriptures that it cannot possibly be reconciled to them." End quote. Consequently, Foscarini argued that the theory is either true or false. If false, it ought not to be divulged. If true, the authority of the sacred scriptures will not oppose it, neither does one truth contradict another. So he turned to the Bible. He found that 6 groups of authorities seemed to oppose this doctrine. 1. Those stating that the earth stands fast, as Ecclesiastes. 2. Those stating that the sun moves and revolves, as Psalm 19, Isaiah 38, and the miracle in Joshua 10. 3. Those speaking of the heaven above and the earth beneath, as in Joel 2. Also, Christ came down from heaven. 4. Those authorities who place hell at the center of the world, a common opinion of divines, because it ought to be in the lowest part of the world, that is, at the center of the sphere. Then, by the Copernican hypothesis, hell must either be in the sun, or if the earth should move about the sun, then hell within the earth would be in heaven, and nothing could be more absurd. 5. Those authorities opposing heaven to earth and earth to heaven, as in Genesis 1, Matthew 6, etc., since the two are always mutually opposed to each other, and heaven undoubtedly refers to the circumference, earth must necessarily be at the center. 6. Those authorities, rather of fathers and divines than of the sacred scriptures, who declare that after the day of judgment the sun shall stand immovable in the east and the moon in west. Foscarini then lays down in answer 6 maxims, the first of which is that things attributed to God must be expounded metaphorically according to our manner of understanding and of common speech. The other maxims are more metaphysical, as that everything in the universe, whether corruptible or incorruptible, obeys a fixed law of its nature. So, for example, fortune is always fickle. In concluding his defense, he claims, among other things, that the Copernican is a more admirable hypothesis than the Ptolemaic, and that it is an easy way into astronomy and philosophy. Then he adds that there may be an analogy between the 7-branched candlestick of the Old Testament and the 7 planets around the sun, and possibly the arrangement of the seeds in the Indian fig, in the pomegranate, and in grapes, is all divine evidence of the solar system. With such an amusing reversion to medieval analogy, his spirited letter ends. Some or all of these scriptural arguments appear in most of the attacks on the doctrine, even before its condemnation by the Index in 1616 was widely known. Besides these objections, Aristotle's and Ptolemy's statements were endlessly repeated with implicit faith in their accuracy. Even Sir Francis Bacon, with all his modernity of thought, failed in this instance to recognize the value of the new idea, and, despite his interest in Galileo's discoveries, harked back to the time-honored objections. At first mild in his opposition, he later became emphatically opposed to it. In the Advancement of Learning of 1604, he speaks of it as a possible explanation of the celestial phenomena according to astronomy, but as contrary to natural philosophy. Some 15 years later, in the Novum Organon, he asserts that the assumption of the Earth's movement cannot be allowed, for, as he says in his Thema Coeli, at that time he considered the opinion that the Earth is stationary the truer one. Finally, in his De Augmentis Scientiarum, 1622–1623, he speaks of the old notions of the solidity of the heavens, etc., and adds, quote, "It is the absurdity of these opinions that has driven men to the diurnal motion, which I am convinced is most false." End quote. He gives his reasons in the Descriptio Globi Intellectualis, quote, "In favor of the earth, as the center of the world, we have the evidence of our sight and an inveterate opinion, and most of all this, that as dense bodies are contracted into a narrow compass, and rare bodies are widely diffused, and the area of every circle is contracted to the center, it seems to follow almost of necessity that the narrow space about the middle of the world be set down as the proper and peculiar place for dense bodies." End quote. The sun's claims to such a situation are satisfied through having two satellites of its own, Venus and Mercury. Copernicus's scheme is inconvenient. It overloads the earth with a triple motion. It creates a difficulty by separating the sun from the number of the planets with which it has much in common. And the, quote, "introduction of so much immobility into nature," ellipses inserted, and making the moon revolve around the earth in an epicycle, and some other assumptions of his, are the speculations of one who cares not what fictions he introduces into nature, provided his calculations answer. End quote. The total absence of all reference to the Scriptures is the unique and refreshing part of Bacon's thought. All the more common arguments against the diurnal rotation of the earth are well stated in an interesting little letter from 1619 by Thomas Fiennes, or Fienus, a professor at the School of Medicine in the University of Louvain. Thus Catholic, Protestant, and unbeliever, Fiennes, Melanchthon, Bacon, and Bodin all had recourse to the same arguments to oppose this seemingly absurd doctrine. Fremont, or Fromundus, the good friend and colleague of Fiennes at Louvain, was also much interested in these matters, so much so that some thought he had formerly accepted the Copernican doctrine and, quote, "only fled back into the camp of Aristotle and Ptolemy through terror at the decree of the Sacred Congregation of Cardinals." His indignant denial of this imputation of Turncoat in 1634 is somewhat weakened by reference to his Saturnalite Coenae of 1615, in which he suggests that if the Copernican doctrine is admitted, then hell may be in the sun at the center of the universe rather than in the earth, in order to be as far as possible from paradise. He also refers in his De Cometa of 1618 to the remark of Justus Lipsius that this paradox was buried with Copernicus, saying, quote, "You are mistaken, O noble scholar, it lives, and it is full of vigor even now among many," end quote, thus apparently not seeing serious objection to it. Monsieur Monchamp summarizes Fremont's point of view as against Aristotle and Ptolemy, half for Copernicus and wholly for Tycho Brahe. Fremont's best-known books are the two he wrote in answer to a defense of the Copernican position, first by Philip Landsberg, then by his son. The Ant Aristarchus sive orbis terrae immobilis liber unicus in quo decretum s congregationis S.R.E. Cardinal, annus 1616, adversus Pythagorico Copernicanus Editum Defenditur appeared in 1631, before Galileo's condemnation. The Jesuit Cavalieri wrote to Galileo in May about it thus, quote, "I have run it through, and verily it states the Copernican theory and the arguments in its favor with so much skill and efficacy that he seems to have understood it very well indeed. But he refutes them with so little force that he seems rather to be of an opinion contrary to that expressed in the title of his book. I have given it to Monsieur César. If you wish it, I will have it sent to you. The arguments he brings against Copernicus are those you have so masterfully stated and answered in your Dialogo." End quote. Nearly a year later, Galileo wrote to Gassendi and Diodati that he had received this book a month before, and, although he had been unable to read much of it on account of his eye trouble, it seemed to him that of all the opponents of Copernicus whom he had seen, Fromundus was the most sensible and efficient. Again he wrote in January 1633, regretting that he had not seen it till 6 months after he had published his dialogues, for he would have both praised it and commented upon certain points. Quote, "As for Fromundus, who, however, shows himself to be a man of great talent, I wish he had not fallen into what seems to me a truly serious error, although a rather common one, in order to refute the Copernican opinion, of beginning by poking scorn and ridicule at those who consider it true, and then, what seems to me still less becoming, of basing his attack chiefly on the authority of the Scriptures, and finally of deducing from this that in this respect it is an opinion little short of heretical. To argue in this way is clearly not praiseworthy." End quote. For as Galileo goes on to show, if the Scriptures are the Word of God, the heavens themselves are his handiwork. Why is the one less noble than the other? Fremont replied in 1633 to Landsberg's reply with his second attack, Vesta sive antaris darci vindex, in which he laid even more emphasis upon the theological and scriptural objections. Yet, in ignorance of Galileo's condemnation, he considers the charge of heresy too strong. Quote, "The partisans of this system do not, after all, disdain the authority of the Scriptures, although they appear to interpret it in a way rather in their favor." End quote. He also, and rightly, denies the existence at that time of any conclusive proof. In spite of Fremont's position, the University of Louvain was not cordial in its response to the papal nuncio's announcement in September 1633 of Galileo's abjuration and sentence, in marked contrast to the reply sent by the neighboring University of Douai. The latter body, in a letter signed by Matthias Kellison on September 7, 1633, declared the condemned theory, quote, "should be discarded and hissed from the schools, and that in the English college there in Douai this paradox never had been approved and never would be, but had always been opposed and always would be." End quote. This opposition in the universities in Belgium continued throughout the century to be based not so much on scientific grounds as upon the Bible. This may be seen in the manuscript reports of lectures in physics and astronomy given at Liège in 1662 and at Louvain between 1650 to 1660. Though one of these does not mention the decree of 1616. The General Congregation of the Society of Jesus in 1650 drew up a list of the propositions prescribed in their teaching, though, according to Monsieur Monchamp, himself a Catholic, not thereby implying a denial of any probability they might have. The 35th proposition ran, Terra movetur motu diurno, planetae tanquam viventia moventur ab intrinsico firmamentum stat. The Jesuit astronomer Taukachou, in his textbook, Antwerp 1669, respected this decision, acknowledging that no scientific reason kept him from defending the theory, but solely his respect for the Christian faith. One of the pupils of the Jesuits revolted, however. Martin van Velden, appointed professor of mathematics at Louvain in 1683, debated a series of theses in January 1691. The second read, Indubitum est systema Copernici de planetarum motu circa sole, inter quos merito terra sensatur. His refusal to alter the wording except to change indubitum to certum brought on a stormy controversy within the faculty, which eventually reached the Council of Brabant and the papal nuncio at Brussels. The professor finally submitted, though he was not forbidden to teach the Copernican system, nor did the faculty affirm its falsity, merely that it was contrary to the Roman decree. The professor reopened the matter with a similar thesis in July, thereby arousing a second controversy that this time reached even the Privy Council. Once more he submitted, but solely with an apology for having caused a disagreement. His new theses, in 1695, contained no explicit mention of the Copernican system. At least he had learned tact. The absorption of the German states in the 30 Years' War may account for the apparent absence there of Copernican discussion until after the Peace of Westphalia. A certain Georgius Ludovicus Agricola gave a syllogistic refutation of the doctrine as his disputation at the University of Wittenberg in 1665. While he acknowledged its ingenuity, he preferred to it, quote, the noblest, truest, and divinely inspired system of Tycho Brahe. The 4 requirements of an acceptable astronomical hypothesis, according to this student, are 1. That it suit all the observations of all the ages. 2. That, as far as possible, it be simple and clear. 3. That it be not contrary to the principles of physics and optics. 4. That it be not contrary to the Holy Scriptures. As the Copernican theory does not meet all these tests, it is unsatisfactory. Incidentally, he considers it, quote, ridiculous to include the earth among the planets, because then we would be living in heaven, forsooth, since we would be in a star, end quote. He decides, finally, quote, that the decree of March 1616, condemning the Copernican opinion, was not unjust, nor was Galileo unfairly treated, end quote. 2 years later appeared a textbook at Nuremberg by a Jesuit father based on the 12th century Sacrobosco treatise and without a single reference, so far as I could find, to Copernicus. Another publication of the same year was a good deal more up to date. This was a kind of catechism in German by Johann Henrique Voigt, explaining for the common people various scientific and mathematical problems in 100 questions and answers. He himself, a Royal Swedish astronomer, obviously preferred the Tychonic system, but he left his reader free to choose between that and the Copernican one, both of which he carefully explained. He made an interesting summary in parallel columns of the arguments for and against the Earth's motion, which it seems worthwhile to repeat as an instance of what the common people were taught. Column 1. Reasons for assenting the Earth is motionless. Column 2. Reasons for the belief that the Earth is moved. Column 1, Item 1. David in Psalm 89. God has founded the earth, and it shall not be moved. Column 2, Item 1. The sun, the most excellent, the greatest, and the midmost star, rightly stands still like a king, while all the other stars with the earth swing round it. Column 1, Item 2. Joshua bade the sun stand still, which would not be notable were it not already at rest. Column 2, Item 2. That you believe that the heavens revolve is due to ocular deception, similar to that of a man on a ship leaving shore. Column 1, Item 3. The earth is the heaviest element, therefore it more probably is at rest. Column 2, Item 3. That Joshua bade the sun stand still, Moses wrote for the people in accordance with the popular misconception. Column 1, Item 4. Everything loose on the earth seeks its rest on the earth. Why should not the whole earth itself be at rest? Column 2, Item 4. As the planets are each a special created thing in the heavens, so the earth is a similar creation and similarly revolves. Column 1, Item 5. We always see half of the heavens and the fixed stars also in a great half circle, which we could not see if the earth moved, and especially if it declined to the north and south. Column 2, Item 5. The sun, fitly, rests at the center, as the heart does in the middle of the human body. Column 1, Item 6. A stone or an arrow shot straight up falls straight down, but if the earth turned under it, from west to east, it must fall west of its starting point. Column 2, Item 6. Since the earth has in itself its especial centrum, a stone or an arrow falls freely out of the air again to its own centrum, as do all earthly things. Column 1, Item 7. In such revolutions, houses and towers would fall in heaps. Column 2, Item 7. The earth can move 5 miles in a second more readily than the sun can go 40 miles in the same time. Column 1, Item 8. High and low tide could not exist. The flying of birds and the swimming of fish would be hindered, and all would be in a state of dizziness. And similarly on both sides. Another writer preferring the Tychonic scheme was Longomontanus, whose Astronomica Danica, Amsterdam, 1640, upheld this theory because it, quote, obviates the absurdities of the Copernican hypothesis and most aptly corresponds to celestial appearances, and also because it is, quote, midway between that and the Ptolemaic one. Even though he speaks of the, quote, apparent motion of the sun, he attributed diurnal motion to the heavens and believed the earth was at the center of the universe, because 1. From the account of the creation, the heaven and the earth were first created, and what could be more likely than that the heavens should fill the space between the center, the earth, and the circumference? 2. And because of the incredibly enormous interval between the sphere of the fixed stars and the Earth necessitated by Copernican doctrine. The high water mark of opposition after Galileo's condemnation was reached in the Almagestum Novum, Bologna, 1651, by Father Riccioli of the Society of Jesus. It was the authoritative answer of that order, the leaders of the Church in matters of education, to the challenges of the literary world for a justification of the condemnation of the Copernican doctrine and of Galileo for upholding it. Father Riccioli had been professor of philosophy and of mathematics for 6 years, and of theology for 10, when by order of his superiors he was released from his lectureship to prepare a book containing all the material he could gather together on this great controversy of the age. He wrote it, as he himself said, as, quote, an apologia for the sacred congregation of the cardinals who officially pronounced these condemnations, not so much because I thought such great height and eminence needed this at my hands, but especially in behalf of Catholics. Also out of the love of truth to which every non-Catholic even should be persuaded, and from a certain notable zeal and eagerness for the preservation of the sacred Scriptures intact and unimpaired. And lastly, because of that reverence and devotion which I owe from my particular position toward the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. End quote. This monumental work, the most important literary production of the Society in the 17th century, is abundant witness to Riccioli's remarkable erudition and industry. Nearly 1/5 of the total bulk of the 2 huge volumes is devoted to a statement of the Copernican controversy. This is prefaced by a brief account of his own theory of the universe, the invention of which is another proof of the ability of the man, for his scientific training prevented his acceptance of the Aristotelian Ptolemaic theory in the light of Galileo's discoveries. His position as a Jesuit and a faithful son of the Church precluded him from adopting the system condemned by its representatives, and Tycho Brahe's scheme was not wholly to his liking. Therefore, he proposed an adaptation of the last named, more in accordance, as he thought, with the facts. Where Tycho had all the planets except the Earth and the Moon encircle the Sun, and that in turn, together with the Moon and the sphere of the fixed stars, sweep around the Earth as the center of the universe, Riccioli made only Mars, Mercury, and Venus encircle the Sun, Mars with an orbit the radius of which included the Earth within its sweep, the other 2 planets with orbital radii shorter than that of the Sun, and so excluding the Earth. This he did, 1, because both Jupiter and Saturn have their own kingdoms in the heavens, and Mars, Mercury, and Venus are but satellites of the Sun. 2, because there are greater varieties of eccentricity among these 3 than the other 2. 3, because Saturn and Jupiter are the greatest planets, and with the sphere of the fixed stars move more slowly. 4, Mars belongs with the Sun because of their related movements. And 5, because it is likely that one of the planets would have much in common both with Saturn and Jupiter and with Mercury and Venus also. Then he takes up the attack upon the Copernican doctrine. Delambre summarizes and comments upon 57 of his arguments against it, and Riccioli himself claims to have stated, quote, 40 new arguments on behalf of Copernicus and 77 against him. but these sound somewhat familiar to the reader of anti-Copernican literature, as, for instance, quote, which is more natural, straight or circular movement? Or the Copernican argument that movement is easier if the object moved is smaller involves a matter of faith, since it implies a question of God's power. For to God all is alike, there is no hard nor easy. Although diurnal movement is useful to the Earth alone, and so, according to the Copernicans, the Earth should have the labor of it, Riccioli argues that everything was created for man. Let the stars revolve around him. The sun may be nobler than the earth, but man is nobler than the sun. If the earth's movement were admitted, Ptolemy's defense would be broken down through the elimination of the epicycles of the superior planets. Here, if ever, the Copernicans appear to score, as Riccioli himself admits, but he calls to his aid Tycho Brahe and the Bible. Quote, to invoke such aids is to avow his defeat, is Delambre's comment at this point. There are many more arguments, of which the foregoing are but instances chosen more or less at random, but no one of them is of especial weight or novelty. To strengthen his case, Riccioli listed the supporters of the heliocentric doctrine throughout the ages with those of the opposite view. If a man's fame adds to the weight of his opinion, the modern reader will be inclined to think the Copernicans have the best of it. For omitting the ancients, most of those opposing it are obscure men. Riccioli nevertheless viewed the Copernican system with much sympathy. After a full statement of it, he comments, quote, we have not yet exhausted the full profundities of the Copernican hypothesis, for the deeper one digs into it, the more ingenious and valuable subtleties may one unearth. Then he adds that, quote, the greatness of Copernicus has never been sufficiently appreciated, nor will it be. That man who accomplished what no astronomer before him had scarcely been able even to suggest, without an insane machinery of spheres, for by a triple motion of the earth he abolished epicycles and eccentrics. What before so many atlases could not support, this one Hercules has dared to carry. Would that he had kept himself within the limits of his hypothesis. End quote. His conclusions seem to show that only his position as a Jesuit restrained him from being a Copernican himself. Quote, 1. If the celestial phenomena alone are considered, they are equally well explained by the two hypotheses, Ptolemaic and Copernican. 2. The physical evidence as explained in the two systems, with exception of percussion and the speed of bodies driven north or south and east or west, is all for immobility. 3. One might waver indifferently between the two hypotheses aside from the witness of the Scriptures, which settles the question. 4. There are in addition plenty of other motives besides scriptural ones for rejecting this system. End quote. But with the scriptural evidence he adduces the decree of the Index under Paul V against the doctrine, and the sentence of Galileo, so that, quote, the sole possible conclusion is that the earth stands by nature immobile in the center of the universe, and the sun moves around it with both a diurnal and an annual motion. End quote. Even this great book was as insufficient to stop the criticism of the action of the congregations as it was to stop the spread of the doctrine. So once again the Father took up the cudgels in defense of the Church. The full title of his apologia runs, An Apologia in Behalf of an Argument from Physical Mathematics against the Copernican System, directed against that system by a new argument from the reflex motion of falling weights. Venice, 1669. He states in this that his Almagestum Novum had received the approbation of professors of mathematics at Bologna, of one at Pisa, and of another at Padua, and he quotes the conclusion from Nicetus Orthodoxus, a diatribe by Julius Turinus, doctor of mathematics, philosophy, medicine, law, and Greek letters. Quote, that the sun is revolved by diurnal and biannual motion, and that the earth is at rest, I firmly hold, infallibly believe, and openly confess, not because of mathematical reasons, but solely at the command of faith, by the authority of the Scriptures and the nod of approval of the Roman See, whose rules, laid down at the dictation of the Spirit of truth, may I, as befits everyone, uphold as law. End quote. Riccioli further on proceeds to answer his objectors, declaring that, quote, the Church did not decide ex cathedra that the Scripture concerning movement should be interpreted literally, that the censure was laid by qualified theologians and approved by eminent cardinals, and was not merely provisional, nor for the time being absolute, since the contrary could never be demonstrated, and that while it was the primary intent of the inquisitors to condemn the opinion as heretical and directly contrary to the Scriptures, ellipses inserted, they added that it was absurd and false also in philosophy, in order not to avert any objections which could be on the side of philosophy or astronomy, but only lest anyone should say that Scripture is opposed to philosophy. End quote. These answers are indicative of the type of criticism with which the Church had to cope even at that time. Footnote: one bit of contemporary opinion on Riccioli and his work has come down to us. A canon at Liege, René François Sluys, wrote asking a friend, about 1670, to sound Wallis, the English mathematician, as to his opinion of the Almagestum Novum, and of this argument based on the acceleration of movement in falling bodies. Wallis himself replied that he thought the argument devoid of all value. The canon at once wrote, quote, I do not understand how a man as intelligent as Riccioli should think he could bring to a close a matter so difficult, the refutation, by a proof as futile as this. End quote. End footnote. Stay tuned for the next section of The Gradual Acceptance of the Copernican Theory of the Universe by Dorothy Stimson. Please follow, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast app. Keep in touch with us on Blue Sky, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube, and recommend us to anyone you know who could use a quiet break or a little help falling asleep. Exploration Dreamland is produced, edited, and hosted by me, Sarah Van Zaley. A big thank you to Project Gutenberg and LibriVox for helping me find many interesting publications. Thanks also to Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com for providing the theme music for this show. The title of this piece is Kalimba Relaxation Music, if you would like to visit his website to hear it in its entirety. Sweet dreams.